Charlie Cross Morrison did not begin his life believing he would become a criminal or a symbol of anything at all. He was born into frustration, raised in an environment where anger often replaced opportunity, and grew into a young man searching for someone to blame for his disappointments. By 1943, at just 19 years old, that search led him to the Ku Klux Klan in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. To Charlie, the organization offered structure where his life felt chaotic and certainty where he felt lost. They told him his failures were not personal, that the world was unfair because of others, and that violence could restore balance. Those ideas settled easily into his mind. Hatred became simpler than responsibility, and belonging felt better than doubt. Charlie never questioned the cost of accepting those beliefs. At that age, he wasn't thinking about consequences or futures. He was thinking about power, identity, and finally feeling like he mattered. As the years passed, Charlie's worldview solidified. What began as resentment slowly transformed into entitlement, and entitlement hardened into cruelty. He learned to judge entire communities through slogans instead of experience, reducing people to symbols rather than individuals. This made harmful decisions easier. If others were less than human in his mind, then harming them felt justified. Charlie drifted from job to job, rarely staying anywhere long, supplementing his income with illegal work. He told himself he was smarter than the system, tougher than the law, and protected by his beliefs. The Klan's ideology followed him everywhere, whispering that dominance mattered more than morality. That illusion of superiority allowed him to excuse behavior that would eventually destroy him. He never saw himself as reckless or dangerous. He saw himself as someone doing what was necessary to survive in a world he believed was stacked against him. By 1951, Charlie was running moonshine through Georgia, transporting illegal liquor along back roads under cover of darkness. It was dangerous work, but he believed risk proved toughness. One night near Valdosta, flashing lights appeared behind him. A state trooper pulled him over. In that moment, fear overpowered arrogance. Charlie's thoughts scattered, his heart raced, and every lesson about dominance and control evaporated. Instead of complying, instead of thinking clearly, he reacted. He pulled a gun and fired twice. The bullet struck the trooper in the chest, ending a life in seconds. The sound echoed far longer than the gunshots themselves. Charlie fled, knowing something irreversible had occurred. That single decision erased every remaining path he might have taken. It was no longer about escape or luck. He had crossed a line that could not be undone. Charlie was arrested 3 days later. The manhunt ended quickly, and the legal process moved just as fast. Evidence was overwhelming, and the charge was clear. Killing a law enforcement officer left no room for sympathy in court. The judge sentenced him to death by electric chair. When the words were spoken, Charlie felt detached, as if the sentence belonged to someone else. At 27 years old, his life had been reduced to a waiting period. Sitting in his cell, he told himself he had been unlucky, that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He did not reflect on ideology or choice. Responsibility still felt like something meant for other people. Even facing death, he clung to the belief that the world had wronged him first. In early February of 1952, Charlie was placed on a prison transfer bus, shackled and guarded, headed toward another facility. During the journey, another inmate created a disturbance, drawing attention away for a brief moment. Charlie seized the opportunity without hesitation. He jumped from the moving bus, slamming into the road with violent force. Pain tore through his body, but fear pushed him forward. He ran blindly, driven by instinct alone. 3 inmates escaped that day. 2 were caught within hours. Charlie managed to remain free, but freedom came at a cost he hadn't anticipated. Every step hurt. Every sound felt like a threat. He was no longer a man with plans, only a fugitive counting minutes. The 6 days that followed stripped Charlie down to survival alone. He slept in abandoned barns, rail yards, and empty buildings, never staying in one place too long. He stole food when hunger became unbearable and drank cheap alcohol to steady his shaking hands. He had $7 left and a stolen jacket that barely kept out the cold. Each night he told himself he just needed one more day, one more mile, one more chance. Death felt inevitable, but hope lingered stubbornly. Either he would be caught and executed, or he would outrun fate entirely. That thin belief kept him moving, even as exhaustion and fear slowly wore him down. When Charlie reached New York City, the sheer scale of it overwhelmed him. Penn Station felt endless, crowded with people who moved with purpose while he drifted unnoticed. He had never seen so many strangers in one place. That night, he slept in a subway station, curled against concrete as withdrawal racked his body. By morning, desperation had replaced caution. He needed money immediately, enough to reach Canada and vanish. Every decision from that moment forward was rushed, shaped by urgency rather than reason. He no longer trusted plans. He trusted instinct, even though instinct had already failed him before. A wrong subway line carried Charlie somewhere unfamiliar. When he stepped off at 125th Street, Harlem surrounded him. The neighborhood felt foreign, every face unfamiliar, every sound outside his experience. His old beliefs flared up instantly, warning him that he didn't belong. He considered leaving, but desperation anchored him in place. Then he noticed a dress shop. Clean windows, elegant displays, signs of steady business. His prejudice filled in the gaps. He assumed it would be easy. He convinced himself resistance was unlikely. That assumption would become his final mistake. Inside the shop, Mayme Johnson was working alone, quietly managing her business. She noticed Charlie the moment he entered. His posture, his eyes, the tension in his movements told her everything. When he pulled his gun and demanded money, she did not scream or panic. Instead, she looked at him with calm certainty. Her composure unsettled him. She told him he wasn't from there, that he didn't understand where he stood. Then she said the words that sealed his fate, not as a threat, but as a fact. She told him he had made a terrible mistake. Charlie laughed nervously, believing she was bluffing. He didn't know who she was connected to. He didn't know the rules of the neighborhood he had entered. While he focused on the weapon in his hand, Mayme Johnson locked the door, closed the shop, and made a quiet phone call using coded LA language. Outside, that message spread faster than Charlie could imagine. He had come looking for quick money. Instead, he had awakened an entire community that did not tolerate threats to its own. The police arrived first, surrounding the dress shop and attempting to control the situation using standard procedure. A negotiator was brought in, voices echoed through the closed door, and Charlie pressed the gun closer, believing fear was still his leverage. What he did not expect was what happened next. Slowly, people began gathering outside, not shouting, not panicking, just arriving. Shop owners closed their doors. Mothers stood with children. Elderly men leaned on canes. Within an hour, the street was full. It wasn't a mob and it wasn't chaos. It was presence. The officers sensed immediately that this was different. These people were not here to interfere or provoke. They were here to witness. Their silence carried weight, and their refusal to leave sent a message that could not be ignored. Charlie, trapped inside, had no idea that the balance of power had already shifted beyond his control. Inside the shop, time stretched painfully slow. Charlie's confidence faded with each passing minute. His hands shook, partly from withdrawal, partly from the growing realization that this situation was not unfolding the way he expected. Mayme Johnson remained calm, speaking only when necessary, never raising her voice. She didn't beg or threaten. She waited. That patience unsettled Charlie more than resistance would have. He asked questions he didn't want answered, demanded reassurance he couldn't get. Every sound from outside felt heavier, more final. For the first time since his escape, Charlie felt truly cornered. The gun that once made him feel powerful now felt useless, an object that could not fix the mistake he had already made. When the crowd parted, the change was immediate and unmistakable. A path opened through the street, and a single man walked forward with calm certainty. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't hiding, he moved like someone who knew exactly where he belonged. Ellsworth Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy, stopped just short of the door. His presence alone silenced the street. In his hand was a straight razor, opened slowly, deliberately. The sound it made carried farther than shouting ever could. He spoke without raising his voice, explaining the choices available, though everyone understood there was only one real outcome. His words were not emotional, they were practical. This was business, and a boundary had been crossed. Inside, Charlie felt something break. The stories he had believed about strength and dominance collapsed under the weight of reality. He tried to tell himself this was still a bluff, still a standoff he could control. But doubt had taken root. When the door finally gave way, splintering inward under force, instinct took over. Charlie raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The weapon jammed. In the brief second, Every illusion failed him at once. The power he thought he held vanished, replaced by panic and disbelief. He had nothing left to rely on. Bumpy Johnson moved quickly, closing the distance before Charlie could react. The razor flashed once, precise and controlled. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to mark. Pain exploded across Charlie's throat, warm blood soaking his hands as he staggered backward. He screamed, not from anger, but from fear. He slid down the wall, shaking, realizing he was alive only because someone else decided he should be. The message was clear. This was a lesson, not an execution. A reminder of where he stood and what lines could not be crossed without consequence. When police re-entered, the scene was already over. Charlie was bleeding but conscious, his weapon lying useless on the floor. Statements were made, explanations offered, and a version of events was quietly accepted. Mayme Johnson was safe. That was what mattered. Charlie was taken away on a stretcher, his hands pressed to his throat, eyes wide with shock. The crowd watched as the ambulance doors closed. No one celebrated. No one needed to. The outcome spoke for itself. At the hospital, doctors worked carefully, stitching the wound with professional detachment. They noted how clean the cut was, how intentional. Charlie lay still, staring upward, feeling the weight of what had happened settle into him. The scar would heal, but it would never disappear. It would follow him wherever he went. For the first time, Charlie understood what it meant to be powerless. Not arrested, not chased, powerless. That understanding hurt more deeply than the wound itself. The next day, Georgia authorities arrived to collect him. Shackled and silent, Charlie was transported south once again. The journey felt longer than before. Every movement pulled at his stitches, each jolt of the road reminding him of Harlem. He replayed the moment again and again, not with rage, but with disbelief. He had survived something far worse than death row, and that survival carried its own burden. The illusion that he had been strong was gone forever. Back at Reedsville State Prison, Charlie returned to a familiar routine, but he was no longer the same man. Other inmates noticed the scar immediately. They asked questions. He lied. He said it was an accident, a fight, anything but the truth. Telling the truth would have meant admitting that everything he believed about power was wrong, and that truth was harder to face than execution. As weeks passed, Charlie's world grew smaller. Each day brought him closer to a date he could not avoid. He spent long hours thinking, not about escape, but about how easily certainty had fooled him. The scar on his throat became a quiet companion, reminding him every morning of the moment his beliefs failed. He began to understand, too late, that hatred had never protected him. It had only guided him to the end. Charlie's final weeks unfolded with a heavy stillness. Death row followed a rigid rhythm, and he learned it quickly, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing else to learn. Meals arrived at the same time. Counts were taken the same way. Days passed without meaning. The scar on his throat itched as it healed, a physical reminder that his body had survived something his beliefs had not. He spent long hours lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments not just from Harlem, but from his entire life. He began to see patterns he had never acknowledged before. Every decision rooted in anger, every shortcut built on blame. For the first time, he wondered who he might have been if he had chosen differently. That question stayed unanswered, but it refused to leave him alone. Other inmates watched Charlie closely. Death row had its own unspoken language, and scars always told stories. Some men respected him for escaping, others pitied him, but most were simply curious. They asked where the mark on his throat came from. Charlie never told the same story twice. Sometimes he said it was from his escape. Other times he blamed a guard or a fight. Each lie came easily, but none of them satisfied him. The truth felt heavier than silence. Admitting what really happened would have meant admitting fear, and fear contradicted everything he had built his identity on. So he kept lying, even as the lies grew thinner and less convincing with time. At night, the prison was loud in its own way. Metal. Doors echoed. Distant voices carried through concrete corridors. Charlie listened to those sounds and thought about Harlem, about how quiet the street had been when the crowd gathered. That silence felt different now. It hadn't been empty. It had been focused. He began to understand that power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited patiently, confident it would be heard when the time came. That realization unsettled him. His entire life had been built on noise, intimidation, and threats. Harlem had answered him with calm certainty, and he had lost. As his execution date approached, Charlie noticed a change in himself. The anger that once fueled him had faded into something duller, heavier. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, and he wasn't trying to justify his past anymore. He was simply aware of it. Each memory surfaced without excuses attached. He remembered joining the Klan, remembered how easy it felt to accept their explanations. He remembered pulling the trigger in Georgia and feeling time collapse in on itself. And he remembered the moment in Harlem when the gun failed him completely. Those memories lined up like evidence, and for the first time, he did not argue with them. The guards treated Charlie the same as they treated every condemned man, with professional distance and routine efficiency. Still, some noticed his quietness. He no longer argued. He no longer postured. He followed instructions without resistance. When asked if he needed anything, he usually shook his head. There was nothing left to ask for. In private moments, he touched the scar on his throat, not with fear, but with recognition. That line of healed skin marked the moment when illusion ended and understanding began. It was the only lesson that ever truly reached him. On the morning before his execution, Charlie was offered the chance to make arrangements, write letters, or speak with the chaplain. He declined most of it. Words felt unnecessary now. Any explanation he could give would fall short of the truth he carried. He ate quietly, tasting very little, his thoughts fixed somewhere far from the prison walls. He wasn't thinking about heaven or forgiveness. He was thinking about the difference between the man he thought he was and the man he had actually been. When the day arrived, procedures moved forward without drama. Charlie was escorted from his cell, his steps steady, his face unreadable. Witnesses later described him as calm, almost detached. As they strapped him into the chair, he winced slightly when the leather pressed against his throat. His fingers brushed the scar once more, instinctively, as if grounding himself in reality. He did not speak, he did not protest, he simply waited. The execution itself was brief. Official reports would later describe it as routine, efficient, and uneventful. A life reduced to a line in a ledger. The system recorded his name, his crime, and the time of death. There was no space in those records for Harlem, for a doctor's shop, or for a lesson learned too late. To the state, Charlie Cross Morrison was a case closed. But stories rarely live in official documents. They survive in memory, shaped by meaning rather than procedure. Charlie's story did not end with the execution. It lingered, not because of who he was, but because of what his life demonstrated. Hatred had promised him power and delivered only weakness. Violence had offered control and left him exposed. In the end, the truth he avoided for decades became impossible to ignore. Far from Georgia, Harlem continued to move forward. The streets remained busy. Shops opened and closed. Life carried on. Yet the story of what happened in that dress shop remained, passed quietly between people who understood it without needing explanation. It was not a tale of brutality, but of boundaries. A reminder that respect mattered, that community mattered, and that some mistakes could not be undone once they were made. The dress shop reopened the morning after everything happened, its new door still smelling of fresh wood. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary, just another business starting the day. Inside, however, there was a quiet awareness that something had changed. Customers arrived not only to shop, but to check in, to offer small smiles and gentle words. No one asked for details. None were needed. The neighborhood understood what had occurred and why. What mattered was that one of their own had been protected. The shop remained a place of dignity, not fear, and that alone felt like a victory. Life moved forward, steady and deliberate, exactly the way Harlem preferred it. Mayme Johnson returned to her routines without hesitation. She arranged fabric, greeted customers, and balanced her accounts as she always had. What stood out was not trauma, but resolve. She did not carry herself like someone who had been saved. She carried herself like someone who had never been helpless to begin with. The events of that day did not define her, nor did she allow them to reshape her identity. Instead, they reinforced something she already knew. Strength did not require noise. Confidence did not require threats. And power, when real, did not need to announce itself. Ellsworth Johnson never discussed the incident publicly. He didn't explain, justify, or deny anything. There was no need. In Harlem, silence often carried more meaning than words. People understood that what happened was not about anger or revenge. It was about lines that existed long before Charlie Morrison ever arrived. Those lines had been crossed, and the response had been measured, controlled, and final. That restraint was what made it effective. It reminded the neighborhood, and anyone watching closely, that order could exist without chaos when rules were respected. The crowd that gathered that day became part of the story, though most never spoke about it openly. They remembered where they stood, who stood beside them, and why they stayed. It wasn't courage driven by confrontation, it was loyalty rooted in shared understanding. Each person had played a role simply by being present. Together, they formed a boundary that no weapon could overpower. That quiet unity mattered more than any single action inside the shop. It showed that protection did not always come from force, but from collective certainty. In the years that followed, the story changed slightly each time it was told. Details shifted, timelines blurred. But the core remained the same. An outsider had arrived believing fear would give him control. He left knowing fear had given him nothing. That lesson endured because it was simple and undeniable. Harlem did not celebrate violence, it respected balance. Those who lived there understood that safety came from knowing when to stand firm and when to remain silent. Charlie Morrison's name faded quickly outside official records. To the justice system, he was another condemned man whose sentence had been carried out. His file was closed, his belongings catalogued and discarded. There was no ceremony, no reflection, but the meaning of his final months lived on in places untouched by paperwork. His story became less about his crimes and more about what his life revealed when stripped of excuses. The scar he carried to the electric air was more than a wound. It was the physical end of an illusion he had spent years building. It marked the moment when ideology failed him completely. Hatred had promised him strength. Violence had promised him control. Neither had prepared him for reality. That realization arrived too late to change his fate, but it reshaped his final understanding of himself and the world he had misunderstood. For those who remembered the story, it was never about glorifying one man or condemning another. It was about recognition that communities function on respect, not intimidation. Recognition that identity built on hate eventually collapses under its own weight. Recognition that some lessons, once ignored long enough, arrive with consequences that cannot be escaped. Harlem continued to thrive, shaped by its people, its culture, and its unwritten rules. Visitors came and went. Some learned quickly, others learned the hard way. But the neighborhood remained what it had always been, watchful, resilient, and deeply connected. The story of the dress shop became part of that living memory, not as a warning shouted aloud, but as knowledge quietly passed on. In the end, Charlie Cross Morrison did learn something. He learned that power taken through fear is fragile. He learned that belonging built on hate is hollow, and he learned that some mistakes cannot be outrun, only understood when it is already too late. His life ended far from where that lesson was taught, but its meaning stayed behind, rooted in a place that knew exactly who it was and why it stood together.